What made the most dangerous horse in Dry Creek stop fighting the moment the quiet bride stepped into the rain? A fence rail exploded with a crack that echoed across the ranch. Horses scattered, men shouted. Mud sprayed under pounding hooves as a black stallion charged across the pasture, wild-eyed and impossible to catch. Then a woman in a rain-soaked wedding dress walked through the storm alone. No rope, no whip, just steady footsteps and an outstretched hand. The horse froze, and what happened next left the entire ranch staring in silence. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and if stories like this speak to your heart, I'd love to have you along for the journey. The church bell rang twice across Dry Creek Valley on a cold spring morning. Wagons lined the dirt road. Horses stood tied to hitching posts. Men in work coats and women in Sunday dresses gathered outside the white wooden church, pretending not to stare. But everyone was staring. Wyatt Mercer was getting married. That alone would have been enough to draw a crowd. For years, people had assumed the owner of Hollow Ridge Ranch would stay a bachelor forever. He was respected, reliable, quiet. The kind of man who fixed his own fences and paid his ranch hands on time. Yet somehow, at 39 years old, he had never taken a wife. Then Ruby Bennett arrived. The whispers started before her boots touched the church steps. A woman near the gate leaned toward her friend. "I give her a month." Another shook her head. "Not even that." Ruby heard every word as she stepped down from the wagon. She wore a simple cream-colored dress. Nothing fancy. The sleeves had been carefully mended near the cuffs. Her small traveling bag rested beside her feet. She kept her chin level and her eyes forward. The Wyoming wind tugged gently at the edge of her veil. No one came forward to greet her except Clara Whitfield. The older woman offered a warm smile and squeezed Ruby's hand. "You walk straight ahead, dear." Ruby nodded. That was enough. Inside the church, sunlight spilled through narrow windows and stretched across the wooden floorboards. Wyatt stood near the altar, hat in his hands. When Ruby entered, he looked up. Neither smiled. Neither looked away. For a brief moment, the noise of the church seemed to disappear. Then the minister cleared his throat. The ceremony lasted less than 15 minutes. No music, no celebration. Just simple vows spoken beneath a wooden cross. When it ended, the crowd filed outside carrying their opinions with them. Ruby heard pieces of them drifting through the wind. Poor girl. Poor Wyatt. Strange match. Won't last. She climbed into Wyatt's wagon without answering any of it. The road to Hollow Ridge Ranch stretched north through rolling grasslands and patches of melting snow. For nearly an hour, neither spoke much. The wagon wheels rattled over hard ground. A hawk circled high above the valley. Finally, Wyatt broke the silence. The ranch hands talked too much. Ruby glanced toward him. So does the town. The corner of his mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile, but close. By late afternoon, they reached Hollow Ridge Ranch. The place was larger than Ruby expected. Long corrals, weathered barns, a blacksmith shed, smoke rising from a stone chimney. Then she heard it. A violent crash. Wood splintered somewhere beyond the main barn. Several ranch hands hurried toward a reinforced pen. One of them muttered a curse. Another stepped backward. Ruby followed Wyatt's gaze. Inside the enclosure stood the largest stallion she had ever seen. Black as midnight, scar across one shoulder, eyes bright with fury. The horse slammed against the rails again. The entire pen shuddered. "That's devil," Wyatt said. 3 men hurt already this year. The stallion pinned his ears and kicked the fence. No one dared step closer. Ruby watched quietly. The horse wasn't looking at the men. It wasn't looking at the fence. It was looking beyond them, toward open country, toward freedom. That evening, after supper, The ranch settled into silence. The sky darkened over Dry Creek Valley. Ruby stepped outside alone. A lantern glowed softly near the porch. From somewhere across the yard came the restless sound of Devil moving inside his pen. Almost without thinking, she walked toward him. The stallion lifted his head. The muscles along his neck tightened. Ruby stopped beside the fence. Neither moved. Neither looked away. Then something strange happened. The horse became still. No kicking, no snorting, no rage, only silence. The Wyoming wind moved through his black mane. Ruby stood there for several moments before quietly turning back toward the house. Behind her, Devil remained motionless in the moonlight, watching her leave. Ruby did not tell anyone. The next morning she was awake before sunrise. The kitchen stove crackled softly while coffee simmered in a black iron pot. Frost clung to the corners of the windows. Outside, the valley was still blue with dawn. She poured coffee into a chipped mug and stepped onto the porch. Across the yard, Wyatt was already working. A ranch hand opened Devil's pen just long enough to replace a water trough. The horse lunged. The man stumbled backward. Several curses drifted through the cold air. Devil slammed against the fence hard enough to shake the posts. Ruby watched quietly. The stallion's anger looked different now. Less like madness, more like fear. The days settled into a rhythm. Ruby swept floors, prepared meals, mended shirts, and helped where she could. Some of the ranch hands remained polite. Others did not. One afternoon, she carried fresh biscuits toward the bunkhouse and heard laughter inside. Maybe Wyatt married her, hoping she'd tame the horse. A few men chuckled. Another voice answered, "Well, if she can tame Devil, I'll eat my hat." Ruby kept walking. She never opened the door, never said a word. Later that evening, Wyatt found the untouched basket sitting outside the bunkhouse. He understood more than she realized. The following morning, he left a small package on the kitchen table before heading out. Inside was a new pair of leather work gloves. No note. No explanation. Ruby ran her fingers across the stitching. The gloves fit perfectly. She never mentioned them. Neither did Wyatt. 3 days later, the weather changed. Dark clouds rolled down from the mountains. The wind arrived first. Then came the rain. By afternoon, the storm had swallowed the valley. Loose shutters banged against walls. Barn doors rattled. The horses grew restless. Ruby was carrying feed sacks into storage when a sharp crack echoed across the ranch. A ranch hand shouted. Then another. Everyone froze. The center rail of Devil's Corral had snapped. The stallion exploded through the opening. Men scattered. Horses bolted from nearby pens. The black stallion tore across the pasture like a storm given legs. Wyatt grabbed a rope and swung into the saddle of a chestnut gelding. "Keep everyone back!" he shouted. Rain lashed sideways. Mud sprayed beneath pounding hooves. Devil charged across the open field. Wyatt pushed after him. For a moment it looked as though he might cut the horse off. Then Devil spun sharply. Wyatt's horse slipped in the wet ground. The gelding recovered, but barely. Several ranch hands shouted warnings. No one moved closer. No one knew what to do except Ruby. She stepped through the pasture gate. One ranch hand grabbed her sleeve. "Ma'am, don't." She gently pulled free. The rain soaked her dress within seconds. Devil was breathing hard now, head high, eyes wide, ready to run again. Ruby walked forward slowly. No rope, no whip, no shouting, only steady footsteps through wet grass. The entire ranch seemed to stop breathing. Wyatt sat motionless in the saddle, watching, waiting. The wind howled across the valley. Ruby stopped 20 feet from the stallion. Then 10, then 5. Devil's muscles remained tight, but he didn't move. Ruby lifted one hand slightly, not reaching, not demanding, simply letting him see it. The stallion lowered his head. An inch, then another. Silence spread across the pasture. Even the ranch hands seemed afraid to speak. Ruby took one more step. Devil blinked. The tension drained from his neck. Slowly, impossibly, the wild horse turned and followed her. Not forced, not trapped. Following. The walk back to the corral felt longer than the entire storm. When Ruby closed the gate behind him, nobody said anything. Rain dripped from hats. Water ran from coat sleeves. The world stood still. Wyatt finally dismounted. For several moments he simply looked at her. Not the way he had at the church. Not the way he had at the ranch. This was different. Like he was seeing someone he hadn't truly noticed before. Ruby brushed wet hair away from her face. "You should check your horse," she said quietly. The corner of Wyatt's mouth moved. "Yes, ma'am." That evening the storm passed. The sunset burned orange across the hills. For the first time since arriving at Hollow Ridge Ranch, Ruby felt the eyes around her had changed. Not all of them, but enough. After supper, a rider appeared at the front gate. A polished carriage followed behind him. The man climbing down wore an expensive coat despite the mud. Gideon Pike, one of the wealthiest men in Dry Creek. He greeted Wyatt with practiced ease. Then his gaze shifted toward Ruby. The color drained from his face, only for a second. But Ruby saw it. Recognition. Not surprise. Recognition. As though he had seen a ghost. Gideon quickly looked away. His smile returned too fast, too carefully. He stayed less than 10 minutes. Then he climbed back into his carriage and left before darkness settled over the valley. Ruby stood on the porch watching the wagon disappear down the road. Something about the man troubled her. She couldn't explain why, but she knew one thing. Gideon Pike had recognized her. And whatever memory he carried, he was afraid of it. Ruby stood on the porch long after the carriage disappeared into the darkness. A lantern swayed gently beside the door. Somewhere beyond the barns, Devil shifted inside his pen. The night felt different now. Not dangerous, unfinished. The next morning arrived clear and cold. Fresh sunlight spilled across the valley. Wyatt was repairing a broken fence line near the north pasture when Ruby carried a toolbox out to him. Neither mentioned Gideon. Not at first. Wyatt drove a nail into a weathered post and glanced toward her. "You know him?" Ruby hesitated. "A long time ago, maybe." "Maybe?" She wiped dust from her hands. "I can't place it." Wyatt nodded once. He didn't push. That was something she had begun to notice about him. He rarely demanded answers. The fence repair took most of the morning. They worked side by side beneath an open Wyoming sky. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't. The silence between them no longer felt uncomfortable. By early summer, Hollow Ridge Ranch had settled into a rhythm. Ruby learned the names of every horse. The horses learned hers. Even Devil had changed. He still allowed nobody into the pen except Wyatt. But whenever Ruby appeared nearby, the stallion watched her quietly instead of pacing. The ranch hands noticed. So did the town. At first, the stories were harmless. Then Gideon Pike began talking. The rumors spread slowly through Dry Creek. A comment at the feed store. A conversation outside the church. A quiet remark near the barber shop. People started repeating strange stories about Ruby. That she had fooled wealthy men. That she carried secrets. That Wyatt was being used. Most of the stories changed every time they were told, but the damage traveled faster than the truth. One Saturday afternoon, Ruby entered the general store to collect coffee, flour, and lamp oil. The conversation stopped the moment she walked in. Nobody said anything directly. Nobody needed to. She paid for her supplies and left. Outside, she found Wyatt waiting beside the wagon. He took the flour sack from her arms without a word. As they drove home, neither mentioned what had happened. Still, Ruby noticed his jaw remained tight the entire ride. A few days later, she was cleaning the tack room behind the main barn. Dust floated through beams of sunlight. Old saddles hung along the walls. Leather creaked softly whenever the wind pushed through the cracks. She pulled an old saddlebag from a shelf and shook out years of dust. Something slipped free. A photograph. Ruby picked it up. 4 young men stood beside a wagon. One of them froze her in place. Owen Bennett. Younger. Smiling. Alive. The breath caught in her throat. Her fingers tightened around the edges. Standing beside Owen was another face. Gideon Pike. Much younger, but unmistakable. Ruby stared at the image for a long moment. When Wyatt returned that evening, she handed it to him. He studied the photograph. "I found it in my father's old storage room," he said. "You know these men?" Ruby pointed. "This is Owen." Wyatt looked up. The name hung in the air. He had never asked much about her past. Now he waited. Carefully. "He was going to marry me." The room became very still. Outside, the sound of horses drifted from the corrals. Wyatt lowered the photograph. "And Gideon knew him?" Ruby nodded. "Apparently." The next morning, Wyatt rode into town. He found Gideon outside the feed warehouse checking delivery receipts. When Wyatt showed him the photograph, something changed, only for a second, but it was enough. Gideon's smile disappeared. His hand tightened around the papers. Then the smile returned. Too quickly. Too perfectly. "I haven't seen that picture in years," Gideon said. Wyatt never took his eyes off him. "Funny thing," he replied. "You looked surprised." Gideon laughed. The sound carried no warmth. By the time Wyatt returned to the ranch, he had more questions than answers. The following week brought another surprise. A stagecoach rolled into Dry Creek carrying only 2 passengers. One was a gray-haired retired driver named Amos Turner. Most people barely noticed him. Ruby did. Because the moment he stepped off the coach and saw her, he stopped walking. The color drained from his face. For several seconds, he simply stared. Then he removed his hat. His voice came out rough and uncertain. "Lord above." Ruby frowned. "Do I know you, sir?" Amos swallowed hard. "I don't know how that's possible." "How what's possible?" The old driver looked directly at her. "I thought you died after what happened to Owen." Everything around them seemed to stop. The wagon wheels, the conversations, even the wind. Ruby felt the world tilt beneath her feet. And for the first time in years, the name Owen Bennett no longer belonged to the past. It had just stepped into the present. Ruby barely remembered leaving the street. One moment she was standing beside the stagecoach. The next, she was seated at a small table inside Clara Whitfield's boarding house with a cup of coffee growing cold between her hands. Amos Turner sat across from her. Wyatt stood near the window. Nobody rushed him. Nobody interrupted. Outside, Dry Creek carried on as though nothing had happened. Inside, everything had changed. Amos removed his hat and turned it slowly in his hands. "I drove freight and mail routes back then," he said. "Owen hired me more than once." Ruby stared at him. "He left." The words sounded smaller than she intended. Amos shook his head. "No, ma'am." Silence filled the room. He was planning a wedding. Ruby lowered her eyes. He stopped writing. Amos looked toward Wyatt before answering. "That's the strange part." He didn't. The room seemed to narrow around those words. Amos explained how Owen had written letter after letter. Some had been sent through him, Others had been handed off through intermediaries. Every one of them had disappeared. Ruby listened without moving. By the time the old driver finished, the coffee in her cup was completely cold. That evening, Wyatt saddled 2 horses. Neither spoke much as they rode north toward Redstone Canyon. Amos had given them directions before leaving town. A forgotten trapper cabin, an old hiding place, a name Owen had mentioned years earlier. The ride took most of the day. The canyon walls rose around them in layers of red stone and shadow. Wind moved through the pines above. Loose gravel shifted beneath the horses' hooves. Near sunset they found it. A weather-beaten cabin leaning slightly against the hillside. One shutter hung crooked. The chimney had partially collapsed. Nobody had lived there for years. Inside, dust covered everything. A rusted stove, broken shelves, an old table missing one leg. Wyatt moved slowly through the room. Ruby stood near the window. The silence felt heavy. Then Wyatt noticed something. One floorboard near the fireplace sat slightly higher than the others. He knelt, pried it loose with a pocket knife, and froze. Beneath the floor lay a small wooden box. Ruby dropped to her knees beside him. The lid creaked open. Inside were bundles of letters tied with faded twine, a leather journal, several folded documents. For a long moment, neither touched anything. Then Ruby picked up the first envelope. Her name was written across the front, in Owen's handwriting. The sight of it nearly stole her breath. She opened one carefully. The paper crackled with age. Ruby, I haven't heard from you in weeks. Gideon says you've changed your mind. I don't believe him. I can't believe him. Her hand trembled. Not much. Just enough. She opened another, and another. Months of letters, questions, promises, plans, hope, all trapped inside a box nobody was meant to find. The sun slipped below the canyon rim. Shadows stretched across the cabin floor. Ruby sat surrounded by letters that should have reached her nearly 10 years earlier. Across from her, Wyatt quietly opened the journal. Page after page revealed the same story. Owen had never abandoned her. He had been deceived, manipulated, turned against the woman he loved by lies delivered through someone he trusted. Gideon Pike. The name appeared again and again. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The wind rattled the cabin walls. A lantern glowed softly between them. Finally, Ruby folded one of the letters and pressed it against her chest. She stared into the darkness beyond the doorway. What a waste. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Wyatt looked up. She wasn't crying. That somehow made it harder. Years had been taken from her. Years that could never be returned. Wyatt wanted to say something. Nothing felt big enough. So he stayed where he was. Close. Present. That seemed to matter more. Hours later, as they prepared to leave, Wyatt turned to the final pages of Owen's journal. His eyes narrowed. Then he stopped reading. Ruby noticed immediately. What is it? Wyatt handed her the book. The final entry had been written only days before Owen's death. The handwriting was rushed, uneven, as though he feared running out of time. If anything happens to me, Gideon Pike must be stopped. He stole more than my future. He stole ranches, deeds, land from families who trusted him. The proof is with the records. Don't let him bury this too. Ruby stared at the words, then at the financial documents inside the box. Property transfers, signatures, records spanning years. The letters had revealed a broken love story. The papers revealed something far larger. Gideon Pike had been building his fortune on stolen lives, and Owen Bennett had known it before he died. The wind swept through the canyon outside. The lantern flame flickered. Wyatt closed the box slowly. Tomorrow they would return to Dry Creek. Tomorrow, everything would change. The ride back from Redstone Canyon began before sunrise. The wooden box rested securely behind Wyatt's saddle. Inside were Owen Bennett's letters, his journal, and the records that had waited nearly 10 years to be found. Ruby said very little. The wind moved across the high country and carried the smell of pine and cold stone. She rode beside Wyatt with one of Owen's letters folded carefully inside her coat pocket. Not because she intended to read it again, because she wasn't ready to let it go. By the time they reached Dry Creek, word had already spread that the annual horse auction was underway. Wagons crowded the roads. Ranchers filled the auction grounds. Money changed hands. Horses stamped and snorted inside temporary pens. At the center of it all stood Gideon Pike, confident, relaxed, smiling as if the valley belonged to him. He was speaking with several buyers when Wyatt and Ruby arrived. Gideon's smile faded, only slightly, but this time everyone saw it. Sheriff Walter Briggs met them near the auction platform. Wyatt handed him the journal without a word. The sheriff spent nearly an hour reading through the documents inside the office behind the auction grounds. The crowd grew restless. People whispered. Something unusual was happening. Finally, Sheriff Briggs stepped onto the platform. The noise slowly died. Gideon folded his arms. "What exactly is this about, Sheriff?" Walter Briggs looked out across the crowd. Then he opened Owen Bennett's journal. The first passage he read was short. The second was worse. By the third, silence had settled over the entire valley. Names appeared. Property transfers. False debts. Land taken from struggling ranchers who never understood how they had lost everything. Then came the letters. Dozens of them. Letters Owen wrote to Ruby. Letters Ruby never received. Letters proving that Gideon had lied to both of them. A murmur rolled through the crowd. Several older ranchers exchanged uneasy glances. One man stepped forward. Then another. Then a widow from the North Ridge. Each carried their own story. Each connected somehow to Gideon Pike. The pattern became impossible to ignore. For the first time since anyone could remember, Gideon Pike looked uncertain. "Those papers prove nothing," he said. But his voice lacked conviction. Nobody answered him. They were too busy listening. Sheriff Briggs continued reading. When he finally finished, the valley seemed to hold its breath. Gideon looked toward Ruby, perhaps expecting anger, perhaps expecting revenge. Instead, she walked onto the platform herself. The same woman people had laughed at outside the church months earlier. The same woman they said wouldn't last. Ruby stood quietly and looked across the crowd. Her gaze moved from face to face. Neighbors, ranchers, shopkeepers, people who had repeated rumors, people who had believed them. She spoke softly, yet every word carried. "I spent years believing someone I loved chose to leave." No one interrupted. "I spent years believing I wasn't worth staying for." The wind tugged gently at her sleeves, but the truth was stolen before either of us ever had the chance to see it. She paused. The auction grounds remained completely silent. "I can't get those years back." Her eyes briefly found Wyatt, then returned to the crowd. "None of us can. No accusation. No shouting. Just truth." And somehow that felt heavier than anger ever could. When she stepped down from the platform, nobody spoke. Not because they had nothing to say, because there was nothing left to argue. The silence followed Gideon Pike all the way out of Dry Creek. Months passed. Summer settled over Wyoming. Grass returned to the hills. The shadows of spring faded. At Hollow Ridge Ranch, life moved forward. The rumors disappeared. The ranch prospered. Devil became something of a legend. Visitors came just to see the black stallion that nobody could tame except the quiet woman who had earned his trust. One evening near sunset, Wyatt and Ruby rode together along the ridge overlooking the valley. The sky glowed gold. Below them, cattle moved like scattered shadows across the grasslands. Neither hurried to speak. Eventually, Wyatt stopped his horse. Ruby did the same. The breeze lifted a strand of hair across her cheek. Wyatt watched the valley for a moment. Then he said, "When we married, I thought I was solving a problem." Ruby listened. "I needed help with the ranch." His fingers rested loosely on the saddle horn. "I told myself it was practical." A faint smile touched her lips. "Was it?" "At first." The answer made her laugh quietly. The sound drifted into the evening air. Wyatt looked toward her. "Somewhere along the way, I stopped imagining this place without you." The words remained between them. Simple. Honest. Nothing more was needed. Ruby reached across the space separating their horses and placed her hand over his. Neither spoke again. The sunset spoke for them. The following spring, Dry Creek gathered once more, this time outside the church, not for a wedding, for a celebration. A second beginning. Children ran through the grass beside the building. Neighbors shared pies and coffee beneath long wooden tables. Laughter carried through the valley. Near the pasture fence, Devil stood watching everything with calm eyes. Ruby rested one hand against the stallion's neck. The horse lowered his head slightly. Across the field, Wyatt waited for her. Years earlier, the valley had laughed when she arrived. Now the same valley told her story. Not because she had tamed the wildest horse, because she had refused to let bitterness tame her. Ruby looked toward Wyatt, toward Hollow Ridge Ranch, toward the life they had built. And for the first time in many years, the future no longer felt like a place she was trying to reach. It felt like home. Maybe that's why this story stays with us long after the last scene fades. Because most of us know what it feels like to carry something unfinished. A misunderstanding. A goodbye that never made sense. A piece of our past we quietly revisit when nobody else is looking. If you place yourself where Ruby once stood, holding years of hurt without knowing the truth, what would you have done? Would you have closed your heart forever? Or would you have found the courage to trust again when life offered you a second chance? What moves me most about Ruby and Wyatt isn't the wedding, the ranch, or even the wild horse. It's the simple choice they made every day afterward, to stay, to listen, to keep showing up. Sometimes healing doesn't arrive with a grand moment. Sometimes it arrives one quiet morning at a time, through patience, honesty, and the people who refuse to walk away. And maybe that's the lesson hidden inside this story. Not every lost year can be recovered. Not every wound disappears. But a life can still grow around those scars. Love can still find room to breathe. And a future can still become something beautiful. I'd love to know your thoughts. If you were in Ruby's place, which moment would have been the hardest to forgive? And if stories like this remind you that kindness, loyalty, and hope still matter, I hope you'll join us again. There are more journeys waiting down the road ahead, stories of healing, mystery, resilience, and unexpected love. When you're ready, we'll be here to share the next one.